Good evening and welcome. On behalf of Northern Illinois University Libraries, STEM Read, and the Northern Illinois University STEM Read and the University Libraries, welcome to Future Telling. I'm Fred Barnard, and I have the privilege of being Dean of Libraries at NIU and also the moderator of this evening's program. Here we will be discussing The Haunted Mind. I would like to thank the Friends of the NIU Libraries and NIU STEAM for co-sponsoring this series. We'd also like to thank NIU's Division of Outreach and Engagement and Regional Development and the Division of Research and Innovation Partnerships for their commitment to community programming like this. I also want to give a special thanks to Jillian King-Cargile, who I am standing in for this evening, but who did all of the heavy lifting putting this program together. So special thank you, Jillian. These future telling conversations are at their core about hope that rational thinking will win out over fear, hope that science will continue to help us make sense of the world, hope that by working creatively and cooperatively, we can bring about a brighter future. We believe that science fiction and science research go hand in hand and help us to imagine the future. If you're interested in supporting Future Telling, please go to go.niu.edu/give-future-telling and make a donation. We appreciate your support at any level. Now, the stories that evoke fear are probably the oldest of the stories that we share. From the ancient Greeks to the biblical book of Revelations, to the Gothic birth of the modern horror story, and then to our modern horror writers like our guest tonight, we both love and fear the unknown and the frightening. Who hasn't heard something where there should not be anything and either quickened their steps, called a friend, or turned on the lights? Whether you believe in the supernatural or find a rational explanation for every odd noise, you will have to admit that humans have had a long history with hauntings and horror, and it is unlikely to change anytime soon. Tonight's expert panelists include a librarian, a horror writer, and psychologists who have come together to provide us with their own unique perspectives on horror and hauntings. Quote Emily Dickinson, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place." And now I want to welcome our first guest, Conrad Stump. Conrad is a librarian. Let me pull up his bio. Conrad is a librarian and local history associate for the Springfield Greene County Library in Missouri, where he co-coordinates the library's Oh, the Horror series, which attracts hundreds of patrons during October. And he also created the Donuts and Death horror book group. Sounds great. Featured in Book Club Reboot. Welcome, Conrad. Won't you please tell us a little bit about what you do and some of your accomplishments?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So my name is Conrad Stump. I work for the Springfield Greene County Library in Springfield, Missouri. I'm a local history associate, so you might think, what does local history have to do with horror? But it actually has a fair amount, really. The local history programs that we have during our Oh, the Horror series tend to be the most popular. People are, no matter where you live, there are going to be purported hauntings, there are going to be strange creatures, there are going to be murders that take place. And so local history is just ripe for like horrific stories, essentially. And, working in local history, one of the main questions that we get are people who want to know the history of their house. And it takes, some getting them to open up about it, but usually what they're wanting to know is who the ghost is who haunts their house. And, I have to tell them like, well, you're probably not going to find that. So, it doesn't have to be a person who was brutally murdered. It could just be someone who happened to die there but people are very interested in it. And I think, we want to feel like there is more, whether that's more out there in the universe or more out there after death. So I think there's like this just innate attraction to these stories that explore what else could be out there. And so, yeah, about 6 years ago, I knew that I liked horror, and I was like, well, there have to be other people in this community who also enjoy it. So I started a book club called Donuts and Death. I partnered with a downtown donut place called Hertz Donut. And, the book club and I met there every month, and it took a little bit of time to take off like most book clubs, but it became one of our most popular book clubs. And, it's been going for 6 years minus a few months here, the last few months with COVID going on. We did it virtual for a while. We did it on Goodreads, but currently it's taken a break. And then in 2017, Katie Hopkins, who is our adult programming coordinator, we decided to plan a program series called Oh, the Horror. And we had a lot of amazing stuff. We were super lucky to get Grady Hendrix to be there as our first, like celebrity author. So that was amazing. And there's like the haunting that inspired The Exorcist took place in St. Louis. So we had this guy come down and talk about the actual haunting. We showed The Exorcist at a local theater. All of these things were, very popular, and we have done that ever since. And usually there's a theme for the series. So, we sort of did exorcisms, we did, monstrous creatures, we did haunted houses, and let's see, what was this year? Slashers. That's right. Yep. We just had Grady Hendrix again a couple weeks ago, and we just had Stephen Graham Jones last night. We're showing Scream on Friday. So that's kind of a little bit about like the series. But I also am the co-coordinator along with Becky Spratford of the Horror Writers Association's library committee. So the library committee does two things. They plan Librarians Day during StokerCon, where we, interact with other librarians about the horror genre and try to excite them about, getting things for their collections, planning programs, making them feel more comfortable about engaging in horror, or just knowing that, like, if they're interested in it, they're not alone, and that there are people in their communities who also want that. But the big thing that we do is we do a summer reading initiative called Summer Scares. So that's through the Horror Writers Association. We're just finishing up our third year of Summer Scares. But essentially, we choose 9 titles each year, 3 for adults, 3 for teens, and 3 for middle grade. And so, part of the point is to get a conversation around horror going during the summer, especially for, kids and teens when they're out of school and they're sort of, the learning is falling off and they need to keep up with their reading. And so we try to engage people with reading at all age levels. But horror is something that allows us to sort of approach what is difficult in life in a safe space. So especially for kids, I feel like there is a lot there that they can benefit from. And so it's been a really popular program. In my library, we do a Summer Scares programming guide. And so I kind of do the text for that. I work with our art director who does all the art for it. And that goes out to librarians across the country, and they then use it to lead book discussions, to book talk books to patrons. There are read-alikes for the Summer Scares titles. And there are also 4 sample programs for each of the titles. So that way, library workers can feel more at ease with planning programs around horror, or if they want to plan an entire series, they're able to plan an entire series. So we just try to make it as easy as possible for librarians to engage with the horror genre and, in effect, engage with their communities about it. Because especially in library world, I feel like there are a lot of people who maybe are not interested on the staff side. But, just because, and Becky Spratford says this, just because your library patrons want to read about monsters doesn't mean that they are monsters, or something along those lines, right? Like, they're just people who like horror, and you should be able to engage with them about it. So that's kind of a bit about me and about the Summer Scares initiative.
Thank you so much, Conrad. That's really fascinating. We are trying to do something similar with science fiction here.
Nice,
but,
yeah.
Making that connection between young people, especially in
Yes.
science fiction. We actually also, so a portion of Candyman, which came out recently, was actually filmed in our library.
Oh, that's incredible. I
our
love
little, our little claim to fame there.
Yep, that's exciting.
It is, yeah. We're hoping to do a little private screening here soon.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, well, thank you. And now I'd like to welcome our next guest, Grady Hendrix, who I already see a comment. Oh my gosh, it's Grady Hendrix. So that's very exciting. Grady is, of course, an author who needs no introduction. Let me pull up so I don't forget anything here, though. An award-winning novelist and screenwriter living in New York City. He is the author of Horror Stir. I hope I pronounced that right? My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is being adapted into a feature film. And We Sold Our Souls, a the New York Times bestseller, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying, which I totally love. And that's being adapted into a TV series as well. Grady also authored the Bram Stoker Award-winning nonfiction book, Paperbacks from Hell, A History of the Horror Paperback Boom of the 70s and 80s. His latest book, The Final Girl Support Group, is also extremely popular and getting all kinds of good press. So thank you for joining us, Grady. Would you tell us a little bit about your books?
Yeah, well, no, thanks for having me. I write horror, like you said, horror stir. I haven't heard that pronunciation, but I think you're probably actually pronouncing the umlaut correctly, but which is about a haunted IKEA. I've written My Best Friend's Exorcism about possession or deliverance, I guess is what they call it instead of exorcism in Protestant denominations. Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which no surprise is about vampires. We Sold Our Souls, which is the heavy metal horror novel. And then my latest, which is the Final Girl Support Group. And I think everyone sort of knows at this point that Final Girls are the woman who survives a horror movie, even people who are slasher fans. And so it's about several of these women who sort of survive these horror scenarios, and you know, franchises are based on the real incidents that were so horrible for them, and they formed a support group, and now it's sort of many years. They've been together for 16 years. They're adults now, not teenagers, and as they begin to question why they're still obsessed with something that happened to them when they were teens, they begin to die one by one, and their most paranoid member is convinced it's murder. But also, before, you know, I was doing all that, I actually, and I think you and I talked about this, but I used to work, I'm actually very excited to be here horning up in science fiction space, because I feel like that whereas science fiction is about technology, right? I mean, there's exceptions, I'm generalizing wildly, but it's about the external, technology, exploration, all these things. Whereas horror is internal, it's about psychology. It's the science of the human. And I feel a little bit like the other genres, about the other genres like romance and science fiction and fantasy and all these things, the way I think William James felt about science, when he said, you know, people have largely lost interest in science because science has largely lost interest in people. You know, and I feel like a lot of these genres lose sight of the facts of what make us essentially human, and horror sits with that. And the most common of those facts is death. I mean, we're all going to die. It's everything. The one thing we all have in common. And for a lot of different modes of storytelling, death is an ending. I don't know if you remember the Choose Your Own Adventure books as a kid, those interactive books, but you keep getting, you know, you have died, that would be the end. You'd have to put your finger into the earlier part to make your choices and flip forward, and you have like 4 or 5 fingers going because you just kept dying and going back to earlier decision points. But with horror, death is usually the beginning, or relatively early on. And before I did, I was a writer. I was a journalist for a while before I started writing fiction. But before that, I worked for this organization, this nonprofit called the American Society for Psychical Research, which was a parapsychological research organization founded by William James and some other people in 1885 to investigate spiritualist mediums, which were a big deal at the time. And I really just answered a Craigslist ad to answer phones, and wound up working there for 4 or 5 years. And it was fascinating. The history of that period is fascinating. Whether or not anyone was actually speaking to the dead, who cares, man? That is the least interesting part of that story. It's there was such an unleashing of talent. It was such a wild period. And it was really interesting because for me, the difference between sort of going from sort of being very deeply involved in, or not deeply involved, but involved with this organization that paid my rent, that was investigating what, you know, collecting real ghosts and apparitions and reports like that. When I went to write horror, I had to sort of stop doing that. Like my first draft of Horror Store, my first book, I really was like, yes, I'm going to make sure that these follow the model and the template of real hauntings and apparitions. And my editor sent it back, was like, this is a little boring. And that's always been true. You know, these things that happen in reality, you see someone where there's not supposed to be anyone. You hear your grandmother's voice and find out that's when she died 300 miles away. They're very small. They're not very interesting or exciting, but to the person experiencing them, their subjective experience it's profound and really can be life-changing. It's funny, one of the early things that spiritual or parapsychology did that really upset the scientific community was it went to the public. It asked the public to send in to help with investigations, to repeat experiments so they could collect a big set of data, to send in their reports of apparitions or ghosts or things. And a lot of scientists, especially in the UK, were appalled at this because science at the time was about you in the lab or in your research would come up with a hypothesis and a proof that you would present to the public. You wouldn't ask your public to get their grubby mitts on that. And one of the early ones, Nora Sidgwick, a mathematician, whose husband, Henry Sidgwick, who was a professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge, they were the heads of the Society for Psychical Research, which was the UK organization. And in 1882, Nora headed up this huge survey of apparitions. Like, he said, let me know what you've seen, what it was like, give me all the details. And I think she wound up with like 370 usable reports. And out of those, there were 25 that she thought couldn't be explained by mistake, natural cause, exaggeration or anything. And her final bit of evidence that, that these were probably real accounts that the person had experienced as a real event, whatever their cause was that they were far too boring for anyone to have fabricated them. So yeah, so that's sort of where I'm coming from tonight. Happy to be stealing some turf from sci-fi.
Oh, not stealing at all. Happily given. So thank you for being here. I love that you worked in that archive and that you were, firsthand handling these accounts and the idea that they were actually quite boring, I think is extremely interesting. Because you would expect that to be kind of a, Anne Ricean Talamasca type, scenario.
Right.
Where,
Well, and and the experience, it's funny. I mean, Charles Dickens was an avowed anti-spiritualist. He hated it. But, he really did a lot to popularize ghosts, not the least with the Christmas Carol with Marley and his chains and, the three spirits and all this. But he also wrote a much more interesting and kind of profound real account of a haunting he experienced. It was in one of his Christmas numbers of his magazine where he would have some framing story. And this one was that it was a haunted house, and then each contributor, each other author would contribute a single story. Oh, this is the drawing room. This is the bedroom. And Dickens wrote this framing essay for it. And in the framing essay, he very quietly drops this 2-paragraph segment in which he wakes up one morning and earlier than everyone else in the house and sees his father sitting at the end of his bed, whose father had been dead for several years, with whom he had a very fraught relationship. And he sees him sitting at the edge of his bed with his back to him. And he says, and he was there. It was my father. And after a minute, I tried to speak to him and he didn't reply. And I reached my hand out and then he was gone. And he sort of sits with that feeling. And it's a very profound moment for him. And it's beautifully conveyed. But it's so much more boring than A Christmas Carol with like flying spirits and clanking chains.
Yeah. What is it about Christmas and ghosts that we've kind of lost touch with?
Yeah, it's weird. There really is this British tradition of ghost stories at Christmas. It goes all the way back. I mean, Shakespeare refers to it in A Winter's Tale. One of the characters says, let me have a story fit for winter, full of goblins, I think, or something like that, and dark woods. I think I'm probably getting that wrong. So it's an old tradition, and a lot of people feel like, everyone's cooped up inside. What else are you going to do when the nights are dark and there's a fire? And then some nerds try to like really extend it back further to point out that, it's the end of one year and the beginning of other. So in a pagan tradition, death was on people's mind, death and renewal, and et cetera, et cetera. But really, I think it has more to do with everyone's cooped up. What are you going to do to pass the time when it's dark out?
Sure, ghost stories.
Keep
pass the time better than anything. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your exchange with our panelists in a little bit as well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome our two additional panelists Jenna Osterland and Erica Schaefer, both of whom are psychology graduate PhD students here at NIU in the psychology department. So welcome. Let me read a little bit about your backgrounds as well and what you're studying. It's fascinating. Erica Schaefer is a psychology graduate student at Northern Illinois University in the Neuroscience and Behavior program. Her research interests include examining behavioral and neuronal changes, I hope I pronounced that right, neuronal changes following acute stroke or TBI, and progressive Alzheimer's disease, Batten disease, radiation, brain damage. Specifically, the influence of brain damage on navigation, gross motor control, and fine motor control. Welcome, Erica. Jenna Osterland Oltmans is a PhD candidate in the Neuroscience and Behavior program as well. Her research focuses on the neural basis of motor and spatial deficits experienced in neurodegenerative disorders, including Alzheimer's disease, Batten disease, stroke, concussion, and fetal alcohol syndrome as well. She is largely interested in evaluating ways to stimulate neuroplasticity to improve functional outcomes in these disorders. Outside of the lab, Jenna serves as a member of the university's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women and Diversity and Social Justice Committees. Welcome, Jenna. Welcome, Erica. I understand that you have a PowerPoint to share with us as well. So without further ado, please go ahead and present to us.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for having us here today. We want to talk about the neurobiology of fear and the supernatural. So keep in mind, we're coming from a neuroscience perspective today. There's so many different perspectives that we can come at when we're talking about this, but this would be kind of more in the realm of our specialty. So Fred, you already introduced us. So Erica, I think we can skip that slide. So, over half of Americans believe in the paranormal. So we really want to know, why is this? Is our brain hardwired to have haunting experiences? So science hasn't provided evidence yet that hauntings actually exist, but there is plenty of evidence that our brains are able to conjure up a haunting experience on its own. So we can see apparitions, we can sense that somebody is with us, and we can have feelings and even behaviors of possessions, and we can experience immense fear. So neuroscience often refers to these experiences as hallucinations. And hallucinations, they don't only occur in an abnormal brain, they occur in perfectly healthy brains as well. And they're not just an overactive imagination. Hallucinations are experiences that have unique neural markers. And they also have a really important place in our mental lives and our culture. So even thinking about Halloween, hallucinations probably help to make some of our favorite parts of it. So ghosts, demons, and witches. And to better understand the nature of these haunting hallucinations, I want to talk about some of the most frequently reported experiences during hauntings. And then Erica will talk about what happens when we experience this bone-chilling fear from them. So about 1 in 5 Americans have reported seeing a ghost. And this really may not be too surprising, because more than half of the surface of our brain is devoted to processing visual information. So light passes through our eyes, our optic nerves send this information to the visual cortex at the back of our brain, and cells are specialized to detect different shapes, colors, orientations. And what our brain does then is take our past experiences and pulls out the relevant information from what we're seeing. And this helps really create a visual perception for us. However, what's really cool is we don't even need our eyes to see. So our brains alone can provide vision for us. In fact, our brains actually will do this if it's not receiving interesting, changing sensory input. So this is often experienced in people in prisons, for example, who have this boring, monotonous environment. They even call it the prisoner cinema. And this even occurs in blind people. So science did this really cool experiment where they blindfolded participants for 22 days. I cannot even imagine this. And because they did this, they were hoping that the brains would kind of conjure up hallucinations and that they could catch these when these people's brains were being scanned. And they actually found that when participants were hallucinating, activity in the brain was increased in the visual, the parietal, and the prefrontal regions of the brain. But then when they asked these participants to just think about the hallucinations you had, try to imagine them, they found different neural activity. So they found that imagining these same hallucinations activated the prefrontal part of the brain, but not the visual or parietal regions. So this really shows our brain has unique neural activity when we're hallucinating. So there is one visual hallucination that seems to be really shared across cultures, and some of you may have even experienced this. So it's often reported of a ghost or a demon or a witch or an alien sitting on our chest, suffocating us. And this usually happens when you're waking up from sleep. So a lot of people report this as a haunting, but from a neuroscience perspective, we call this sleep paralysis. It's a state of being conscious, but still dreaming. So this occurs when you're in REM sleep, when active, vivid dreaming is occurring. But when you're in this state of sleep, your brain paralyzes your body. Otherwise, you're going to be just violently reacting to these dreams and just acting out your dreams, and that's pretty dangerous. So you are literally experiencing a waking nightmare during sleep paralysis. Most people here have probably experienced kind of a less intense form of this before falling asleep. So often people will have what's called hypnagogic hallucinations. And these are very typically experienced as seeing faces, and they're perfectly normal to have. But what's kind of interesting to think about is, why are we so often hallucinating faces? Whether they be from ghosts or demons or witches, why don't we just see like pretty flowers? So our brain is hardwired actually to see faces, and we'll often see faces in different things. Like you may have reported, or you may have heard the report of people seeing Jesus in a piece of toast, and this is called pareidolia. So our brains just really want to see faces. We need to see faces. We're a social species. They let us know if someone is familiar, what a person is paying attention to, and they can really help us know if people are a threat. So seeing faces innately helps keep us safe. But what's really cool is hallucinations are not just restricted to seeing things. Hearing voices and whispers calling for you is another common feature that people report when they're experiencing a haunting. So one disease where hearing voices is really common is in schizophrenia. So that's a neurological disorder, and often people will report hearing these different commands. They're really negative a lot of the time, telling people to do something. What's interesting is throughout history, these commands were actually often interpreted as messages from the divine. But today it's believed that these voices are not, or these voices are actually the person's own thoughts. But in schizophrenia, there's kind of this disconnect, this inability to recognize the internal voice is self-generated. So fMRI work has shown that there's actually this decreased neural connectivity in people with schizophrenia between the Broca's area of the brain, so that's a region of the brain that's associated with speech production, and the temporoparietal junction. So that's an area of the brain that really supports the feeling of being within your physical body. So abnormal temporoparietal activity is not just occurring in schizophrenia. This occurs in many diseases, like Parkinson's disease happens in migraines, and it can happen in seizures too. And given the structure's role in supporting the sense of an embodied self, glitches that can occur to anyone in temporoparietal activity may underlie some of these experiences of hauntings, especially the feeling of being watched. So the feeling of a ghostly presence or that someone is watching you is totally a hallmark experience of a haunting, or even just something that you may have experienced yourself without calling it that. So hauntings are not the only experience associated with this feeling. There's reports of mountaineers reporting somebody that's with them other than their climbing partner. And this is called the third man. People who are under hypnosis or really meditating can experience this feeling too. And I kind of think that this feeling might be why so many psychics and mediums experience when they're meditating to communicate with the dead. So a feeling of the self kind of projected outside of the self. So I don't think they're all consciously lying to us. And this feeling really emerges from the brain, abnormal activity in that temporoparietal junction that you can see in those red crosses here at brain scans. And also this feeling occurs when there's disruptions and signals to the brain related to movement, specifically proprioception. So proprioception is really truly a real sixth sense. It's a sense of knowing where our body is in space, where it's moving in space. And messing with people's sense of proprioception in the lab can actually conjure up the feeling of another presence. So there was this pretty cool experiment, and they had participants working with this robotic arm. So participants would push a lever in front of them, and at the same time, this robotic arm would touch them on the back. And, you know, fine and dandy, people knew that it was themselves. They recognized this as self-generated. But what's really cool is experimenters just delayed the robotic arm from touching their back by half a second. And most people reported the sense of somebody else behind them. They did not integrate this as something that they generated on their own. And there were actually participants who were so freaked out by this feeling that they dropped out of the experiment. So really what this teaches us is that the movie The Sixth Sense could have been much more scientifically accurate if the line was, "I feel dead people." But the sense of the presence of another is not always just this external feeling outside of us. Sometimes people feel a sense of another within themselves or a possession. So in Grady's book, My Best Friend's Exorcism, the demon within Gretchen mocked her best friend as she was trying to perform this exorcism to really rid her from it. And exorcisms to remove a demon from someone's body are not uncommon throughout history. And Erica, on the next slide, you can see a shot from what many people here have probably seen, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. So the name of the real person who inspired this movie is Annalise. And Annalise was a 16-year-old girl when she started blacking out, walking around in a daze, shaking just uncontrollably, seeing demons. I mean, Annalise, she even broke bones and ripped tendons in her knees because she was kneeling down to pray so frequently. Doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, but her parents were really devout Catholics, and they believed that demons actually possessed Annalise. And the church agreed. And priests performed 67 exorcisms on Annalise in the last year of her life, when she died at age 23 from starvation. And the priests were found guilty of manslaughter. Temporal lobe epilepsy is sometimes referred to as the sacred disease, which it seems in all likelihood that this was the correct diagnosis for Annalise. So temporal lobe epilepsy is this neurological disorder, and it's marked by episodes of these sensory disturbances, losses in consciousness. Deja vu is experienced more frequently, seizures a lot of the time. And what's really interesting is sometimes people can experience hyper-religiosity. And this is associated with abnormal activity, often focused in the temporal lobe. So when people with temporal lobe epilepsy try to treat their disorder with medication, but it fails, sometimes neurosurgeons go into the brain to try to remove the focus of this aberrant electrical activity that's causing epilepsy. But for neurosurgeons to really do surgery right on the brain, they need to kind of map out the brain with electrical spikes before, so they can make sure that they're not totally destroying a completely critical function. So it's really cool. There's this one spot in the brain in this temporal lobe called the angular gyrus. And when neurosurgeons are stimulating this area of the body, people report feeling these out of body experiences. They feel lightness, they feel levitation, and they really just like feel a distorted perception of their own body. So activity in this area during temporal lobe epilepsy can be so intense that it can actually cause cutoscopy to occur. And heutoscopy is the perception of and the interaction with a double of oneself that is often hostile. But temporal lobe epilepsy is not the only disorder that's associated with signs of possession. So ergot poisoning shares many similar features. In fact, it's thought that ergot poisoning may have really led to the Salem witch trials. So this idea came from the fact that in 1951, there was this entire French village that succumbed to ergot poisoning. So they ate bread that was contaminated with this fungus, and people developed really peculiar behaviors. A lot of convulsions, a lot of hallucinations, really extreme insomnia, and really disturbingly, people had this urge to jump from windows. So ergot poisoning affects the frontal lobe, so the region of the brain that's associated with decision making and really orchestrating our thoughts and actions with our internal goals. Meaning, if we want to believe that we're experiencing a haunting, we will. And that can be really terrifying. So Erica is now going to explain to us what happens in the brain when we're experiencing fear.
All right. So thank you so much, Jenna, for giving us some examples of why we might feel fear. But regardless of if it's real, if it's not, we feel that hair stick up on the back of our necks, right? What is that? And there are several events that can cause this. This can be anything from, seeing a ghost to literally fleeing for your life, being chased by a guy with a chainsaw. So, I mean, there's a whole spectrum why we might feel fear. And regardless, fear is triggered from the HPA axis, which activates a cascade of processes in the brain, including changes in both our central and our peripheral nervous system. So let's say, for example, that you see a ghost. The information gets processed in the visual cortex, which is actually in the back of the brain. And then our brain has to figure out, okay, is this a threat? Am I in danger? Should I be stressed? And from that initiation can release a subset of hormones. And there are a few key players that I'm going to hit on. So the first one is cortisol, and the second one is epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline or noradrenaline. So these hormones are triggered from the release in a little area of the brain called the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases something called CRH, or corticotrophin releasing hormone, which communicates with the pituitary gland, which then communicates with the adrenal gland, which is located just above the kidneys. And this initiates what we all might be familiar with is a fight or a flight response. Now, we have a couple of different nervous systems in humans, and we have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. And today I'm going to be focusing on the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. This is our fight or flight. So what happens during this time? There is an increase in our heart rate to pump blood to core areas. So blood vessels from our arms and our legs will actually tighten and restrict blood flow to those areas because, frankly, they're not all that important when it comes down to things. Like if you think about a traumatic accident, or again, I'll go back to my chainsaw guy, your core body is more important than appendages at that time. There's also an increase in oxygen, increase in respiration, a decrease in sensitivity to pain. So this is why people in stressful scenarios escape their perpetrators, even with sustaining substantial injury, which I thought was a great nod in Lynette's case in one of the final events from the Final Girl Support Group book. So again, how are we able to do these heroic events and fight through the pain? It's because of this system, which is pretty awesome. Also, there is a decrease in the urge to eat, use the bathroom, because again, that wouldn't be very advantageous if we all of a sudden had to go in the bathroom when we're in the middle of trying to flee for our life, right? However, one thing is we can't stay in this heightened state the whole time. There needs to be some checks and balances. And actually, the hormones involved in this system will tell the brain to, hey, okay, we need to go back to normal, back to baseline, which is our parasympathetic nervous system, mostly called the rest and digest system, where we can, chill out, reduce blood flow, stimulate gestation, and relax a little bit. However, maladaptive responses to the environment can cause psychological disorders, including PTSD, which again, I think is something that we read about as well. And some of the characters in Those Final Girls definitely had some characteristics of PTSD. And this is where your HPA axis is in hyperdrive, okay? Constantly having the stress response can cause severe negative effects. So again, your hypothalamus is saying, hey, we need this stress hormone to be released. And that influences emotional centers like the amygdala. So you may have emotional changes. Additionally, memory can be changed. So either remembering the event incorrectly or not remembering the traumatic event at all. That can also lead to differences in decision-making associated with our prefrontal cortex. So again, a lot of key components in experiencing trauma or just experiencing fear can really have a full body experience. And with that, I'd like to thank Fred and everyone for letting us share a little bit of the background and science behind all of these great topics.
Thank you. That is really wonderful. I would like to invite Conrad and Grady to join us again too. I don't know if you had any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share after seeing their research.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. Proprioception, is that something, like, have people done much work on sort of people losing track of their body in space? Like, is that purely a biological function, or is that something that can be psychological as well?
That's really interesting. So what I'm most familiar with when this is happening is when people experience hemispatial neglect, when they have stroke. So if a person has a stroke to their posterior parietal cortex, that's kind of like the region really responsible for proprioception. And what's so interesting is when the ability to process or even have proprioception is totally knocked out, people will completely neglect half of their world. They'll eat food on half of their plate. They'll shave half of their face. Sometimes they even think that the other half of their body is like a monster or a ghost or somebody else's leg. There was a story of a guy who had a stroke and was experiencing hemispatial neglect, and he threw his own leg off the bed because he was so freaked out. So I think that it's kind of a both,
Yeah.
things are interacting, because you have, well, first of all, this clear neurological thing that's happening, but then you have this really intense like fear response. You're no longer familiar with your own body or half of your own world. So I'm sure that can just only heighten things.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious because writing in general, but writing horror in particular, you're always seeking what writers call on-the-body sensation. You want to provoke a physical response in a reader in a lot of cases. And I've had, I'm very claustrophobic, so I have a scene in one of my books where someone's sort of stuck in a very tight space. And I've had several people say, oh, I had these panic attacks while I was reading it. And, who knows if it's a legitimate panic attack or they simply felt that way. But I've had people say they felt sick, things like that. And I'm always curious, like, they're simply reading. So at what point are they forgetting their own presence and investing their emotional and even physical state in the fiction? That seems, I don't know, it seems to be a very strange, fuzzy line there.
That's really interesting. And I think that kind of goes with some of the things that I talked about. So even like in PTSD, just thinking about the event or having a memory of that event or watching a movie, or even if, whatever you're afraid of is not physically present, like what Jenna talked about, even just us thinking about it can trigger this stress response, and we can have a full body experience, you know, where we
Right.
feel the panic as some might, you know, or, you know, you're suddenly in this fight or flight mode, you know, when you're reading a book, which I think has a lot of allure of what horror books have, you know, or the horror genre too.
Yeah, reading is PTSD. That'll be the next big library campaign. No,
Thank
but it
you.
is interesting. I mean, even beyond horror. I mean, you look at romance. You look at so much where you're asking someone to forget themselves and their own physical self in the world and become invested in this series of basically black marks on white paper. It's very weird.
It really is. And I think another thing that contributes to these feelings is humans and non-human primates, at least so far we know, we have mirror neurons in our brain. So these really help us kind of sympathize and empathize with people. So, you know, you hear the term like, oh, I feel your pain. That's a real thing. And I think it's because we are so evolved to be a social species. And like Erica was saying with fear, fear is so important to keep us functioning. We're just like primed to look and spot fear, even when we're reading a book, even if we're not physically being threatened. It's just so in our brains to empathize and to feel this fear that it's hard to even logically override this
Right,
reaction.
right. And sorry, what's a mirror neuron? Like the short version for dummies?
A mirror neuron. I only know the short version for dummies. So it's basically this piece, these different cells in your brain that kind of really respond similarly. So if you are watching somebody in pain, these mirror neurons might become more activated. So you're
Mhm.
sympathizing more. Someone's really happy and you're watching that, you know, happiness can be kind of contagious. So it's really
Got it.
just like a supportive mechanism in our brain.
No,
And
it's
I'm just
interesting
gonna
because what,
piggyback.
yeah,
Oh,
no, go ahead.
sorry. So what's really actually interesting is that I know Jenna talked about faces, but your mirror neurons will mimic that very subtly, like unconsciously, that of faces that you see. So literally, if everyone is frowning around you and you are smiling, their mirror neurons, their facial muscles will be affected by your smile. So I always like to think of that as an example. So if everyone around you is just mad and having a horrible day, and you're just put on a smile, and they'll be forced to, you know, smile with you eventually.
Well, no, it's really interesting y'all are saying that. And also when you were talking about, oh gosh, Erica, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was, you were saying about people inducing, like having a panic response and inducing that in the people around them. Is there a name for that process or that
Not,
effect?
not to my knowledge. I don't think that it's a specific process. Again, panic disorder and anxiety disorders, unfortunately, it's not one size fits all, right?
Sure.
So it's hard to nail it down. I think it's just there's so much variability. You know, one person's anxiety and or panic is different from another's. So
Yeah.
I think I don't
Yeah.
have a better name for that.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because that Nora Sidgwick survey I was talking about earlier, a lot of people were a lot of scientific reviewers or of the time we called it childish and refused to read it and then dismissed it. But one of the facts she noted was that she argued, and she referred to these as hallucinations, not apparitions, because she was simply talking about a psychological effect, but was saying that they were often seen to be infectious. And that some of these hallucinations seem like they could be experienced by several people at once. And actually at the ASPR, we had a guy named Keith Harari in the 70s. And he would often do these sort of corporate interventions because one of the places that was the most haunted locations we found was, or he found at the time, were medical record storage facilities, because most hospitals, they're off-site. It's a very small staff in a very large building, and they work at night. So they work an opposite shift because they want to have all the charts pulled for the docs in the morning. And often people would start to say, oh, there's a ghost on sub basement 3. And it would sort of spread through the staff, and people would start not wanting to go to certain sub basements. And it would be a real problem. And so Keith was often brought in to do an intervention. And one of the things, he coined this term stress apparition, which is when someone would begin this sort of panic over this apparition, and it would spread from person to person and the staff who all work very close together. And they would get to the point where other people would start reporting seeing this. And what's a funny side note is he actually did this exercise with the staff with a marshmallow. And it's a complicated, weird thing, but it was called the Marshmallow Ghost. And Dan Aykroyd and his father and brothers are all members of the ASPR, and actually the early drafts of Ghostbusters were based on it. And so Keith was always pretty convinced that they stole the idea for the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from his exercises. But yeah, but this whole idea of infectious hallucinations and stress apparitions, it seems like there's several leaps, but you get into something with motor neuron or mirror neurons at some point.
Yeah, and I mean, the social component, like just on the brain is so powerful. I mean, we think about all of those, you know, classic psych studies where, you know, everyone in a waiting room all of a sudden stands up, and then, you know, the people are like, oh, well, I guess I'll stand, or facing one way in an elevator. I mean, social interactions have so much power over the way that we behave, and then the way that we behave may interpret, you know, how we see, what are we visualizing, which I think Jenna kind of touched on. You know, it doesn't matter if it's there or not, you're still experiencing it, you know. So
sure. Yeah, well, I think it's one reason in horror movies where if you're going to sell a gag, someone opens a forbidden door, and the first thing you see are the characters are on screen, close-ups of them reacting in shock and horror before you see them cut to, you know, a guy in a really unconvincing latex appliance, like, because they're cueing the audience that this is the reaction you need to be having with these enormous 30-foot wide close-ups of these people's faces. Smaller now, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
But the interesting thing also to me is there's a funny gap between what y'all are talking about and what I'm talking about, because I think we're talking about the same thing from two different ends. And it's not to sound like a total dork, but Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, he talked about the experience of seeing. And he was like, you know, seeing is a series of physical effects that at some point leaps to something larger. You know, light enters the lens of the eye, and that's a physical effect. The image is on the retina, it's physical effect. It travels up the optic nerve, it's a physical effect. It's firing certain neurons in your visual, you know, cortex centers, and that's a physical effect. But then suddenly, at some point, we're engaged in the experience of seeing, which is this totality, which is so much bigger than a physical effect and involves so many other things. And so in that gap, in that leap, I feel like there's this, I don't know, there's this space that needs to be bridged.
Oh, absolutely. It's really interesting just to think about, you know, what we see, how many other things totally influence it, other than just like, you know, color, shape, size. We have all of our past experiences that are totally influencing what we see. And it can shape a different experience for so many people. Its vision is very, very interesting, and how it's so internally generated.
Yeah.
And how
it's also pretty biased too. Like, we think about all illusions. Why are illusions so cool? I mean, it's because you're focusing on your attention on what you want to see. Like, I agree. Seeing is literally in the eye of the beholder, because there's so many other areas of the brain that, you know, your past experiences, you know, where your attention is, what do you want to see, you know, that all plays into those physical things that you were talking about. Because otherwise, you know, eyewitness, key witness, illusions wouldn't be necessary, or like it would be more validated.
And I'm going to really get in over my head, but I'm going to push back on that word bias, unless you're using it in a way I'm not familiar with. It's like a specific technical term, because I always feel like bias implies there's some objective reality here. Whereas I think with perception, I mean, it's mostly so subjective for the very reasons you're just stating. You know, the idea that there's somehow some objective version of the world that we should be experiencing, but if you're not, you're somehow off, you're off model. I don't know. Because it seems like the work you guys are doing is very focused on subjective experience.
Yeah, I totally think you're right. And that I think that's like one of the great things that's being better understood in science now. Just because you see something differently doesn't mean there's something wrong with your brain necessarily. And it's just so interesting because what people used to see that didn't match with everyone else's objective reality or like hallucinations in the 18th century and before that, maybe, I think maybe it was before that, that was considered like this divine power. And then we hit this line, and all of a sudden, oh my God, something's terribly wrong with you. We need to fix this. And now I think we're kind of reaching an understanding like, no, like you're saying, what we see is it totally depends on so many different things, and it's not going to be the same for everybody.
Well, and yeah, and then I think that's, yeah, but I think that's why what y'all are doing is so interesting, looking at people with strokes and things like that. My mom was a geriatric psychologist and worked on a big grant, which was about people with Alzheimer's. And the point of it was to approach them not as if there was something defective with them, but to approach them as if, okay, this is the reality of this person. And one of the things they found is obviously that people know is that your short-term memory is garbage, but your distant memory, your memories of things in the way past is often very immediate. So they would do this scrapbooking project with families where they would, you know, that's the way they would interact with their relative with Alzheimer's is they'd look at old pictures together. They would talk about old experiences and not try to focus on these new ones, these experiences of the day or the week, which I think is really interesting because it's saying this person isn't deficient. They simply perceive the world in a radically different way. And if you don't want to have a frustrating experience, you have to get on their wavelength.
Yeah, I think that's pretty amazing work your mom did because I totally agree with that. It doesn't, because you're perceiving something differently doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. And I just think it's so cool how in neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease, the brain reaches so far back and it's still able to pull emotions from these things that are being experienced still. It's really amazing.
So, and I also wanted to ask Erica, because she was talking, Erica, you were the one talking about temporal lobe epilepsy, right? Or was that you, Jenna?
I was hitting on that.
You were, okay, sorry.
No,
Yeah,
you're
no, but I was gonna ask, so are there people who refuse the medication because they enjoy the experience?
There, that's an interesting thing. I definitely have heard about that happening. People who experience just like these amazing hallucinations, it can really inspire art. I mean, like, I think a lot of these experiences have inspired so much of our culture and our art and the way we, come up with these really interesting ideas. And not only do people who are like experiencing the world a little bit different, maybe they don't want to take their medication, but people seek out hallucinogenic drugs because it's so innate to us.
Right.
We so want to see all of these like amazing different perceptions that are able to be seen. So it's like we want to get rid of drugs that stop it. We want to take drugs that cause it. It's
Right.
interesting.
Well, it's also, it brings to mind, because I think there's a component of graphomania too, right? Compulsive writing with some temporal lobe epilepsy. I'm sure there's an array of symptoms. That's one I've seen mentioned before, along with the religiosity and all that. And, you look at some of these 19th century spiritualists who would do automatic writing. And they would fill page after page after page after page with this compulsive writing when they were in a trance state. And a lot of it's very, very grandiose, very religious, and they would do amazing things. I mean, there was Margaret Fox was a medium who was very famous, but she would write one message to a sitter with her right hand while writing a separate message to a separate sitter with her left hand. Sometimes one would be in mirror writing, sometimes one would be in French. And actually, she would also convey often a third message orally to another sitter. So like, you look at that and you're like, you want to put her in MRI while she does that.
Yeah, that's really phenomenal. Wow, yeah. And Conrad, I kind of wanted to ask you from like a historical perspective, have these reports of like what mediums can do, has that kind of changed across time?
Well, I think that belief in it has sort of changed, that the explanation of the sort of phenomenon with like spiritualism and seances and what people could perform, and being a psychic, I feel like the belief in that has sort of waned, where people are more skeptical of it, or there's an explanation for how this person was doing it. So I mean, I don't feel like I see a lot of that, right? At least in mainstream society, right? So I feel like it's sort of gone away. But Grady may know more from his time at the research.
Yeah, I mean, there's some big mediums who still work. Sylvia Brown is one, a couple of others. Some, some of them have reality shows and things like that. And it's amazing how consistent the experiences are. The way they speak, the experiences they describe. And part of it's because they've obviously seen who goes before them, right? And they're copying what comes before because they want to feel like they're part of a tradition. And that they're a facet of a reality there. Oh, there really are spirits, and this is how people seem to talk about this, so I'm going to talk about them also. But there also seems to be some real commonalities in, you look at haunted houses, right? I mean, I think Erica and Jenna were both saying haunted houses are basically the same deck of phenomena that just get shuffled and reshuffled, right? Cold spots, the feeling of being watched, auditory hallucinations. Very rarely do you hear of olfactory hallucinations. Usually they're visual or auditory, or I guess tactile. But so there's things you don't find in haunted houses, and so some people have wondered if there are some physical causes of that. Standing waves, audio waves, just like we can't see all the light on the spectrum, we can't hear everything on the spectrum. And, they just had that thing with those people being made sick by ultrasounds. And so there is that. People don't. There's also Bill Roll and Michael Persinger did a lot of work on the effect of electromagnetic fields. And they were actually able to really convincingly generate haunting phenomena in a lab using electromagnetic fields. People wear these big helmets and they'd sort of like switch magnets on and try to stimulate different parts of the brain. But they could very convincingly give people a feeling that they had someone standing right behind them, that someone was watching them. They would hear their name called. And Bill actually was hired. He was at one point hired as a consultant on this British ghost hunting show, an early one. And it was a guy who lived in this sort of converted flat in Soho in London, and really fancy place, really modern, very contemporary. But he was like, oh, there's a little girl in here and she runs around. And I hear her name, she calls my name and she shakes my bed and all this stuff happens. And so they were gonna have, a night in the haunted flat, and it was gonna be this really like, ooh, it looks so modern, but what are the ancient ghosts? And right early on when they were doing a walkthrough, Bill noticed that the guy's bed was against the exterior wall of the house. And on the other side of the exterior wall were the power transformers for that neighborhood. And he's like, look, I'm not saying anything, but can we just move his bed to the other side of the apartment? And immediately all the phenomena stopped. And like ultimately, who knows, right? Maybe the guy got cold feet, maybe with the camera crew there, but it was like the camera crew was apparently really, really annoyed and actually didn't pay Bill his total contract amount because they were like wanted him there to encourage ghosts, not to sort of end it all.
Can I ask, just is there a biological reason why evening, nighttime terrors, ghosts? I mean, is there a reason why that happens biologically that's been researched?
That's probably more Erica or Jenna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Erica, I can't say that I know a specific answer to that question, but it kind of makes me think of sundowning syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. We have kind of this and this is like in perfectly healthy brains too, we have this cognitive reserve that helps get us through the day, but that really depletes across time. So I think maybe we just don't have, if from a neuroscience perspective, as much mental energy kind of later at night to really help kind of put our logical thoughts on top of it. And additionally, I mean, we've been primed like our whole lives to think of nighttime as spooky, because I think that probably has an evolutionary reason too, because when are you more likely to be hunted down? Probably when you can't see somebody coming for you. So, Erica,
Yeah,
do you know
Jenna.
of any?
Well, I was going to say, human vision is just terrible at night. So, and we rely so much on our vision as humans. Now, is, a cat who has, great vision at night scared of the night? No. And I think that has a lot of things. It's the fear of maybe the unknown, the unseen, what's out there. I don't know. And I agree. I think that it could also be a social thing, growing up being, all right, better be home by dark, or careful, look at all these movies. What happens when all of a sudden the sun goes down? That's when the killing starts, right? So I think it could be a lot of different factors, but sundowning is actually interesting. I didn't even think of that one before, but could be a lot of components playing into why, we're scared of the dark.
Right.
What's
Just
kind
thinking
of
that-
interesting,
Go ahead.
has anyone seen Midsummer?
Mhm.
Because that is one of the very few, probably only movie that I can think of where like scariness is happening in broad daylight. It seems like such a rare thing, but then when I watched that, I was freaked out bad. So I think that kind of the element of surprise can kind of help with those things too. Do you know of any other books or movies where it's usually daytime?
There's a fair number, but not. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, it's rare. It's rare. And I don't want to be a pedant because you're actually making a really good point. But actually, that made me think what you guys were both just saying actually about sundowning is I'm kind of curious, because when we think of things like the feeling of being touched, auditory hallucinations, the feeling of being watched and things, do those get reported by stroke victims? I mean, and do they get reported as haunting phenomena by stroke victims, or just I've had a stroke and now I feel like someone's watching me? Like I don't know. I guess I'm wondering if the context socially changes things. You have a medical diagnosis, so all these things you're experiencing are a part of that diagnosis, whereas you're sitting at home alone and you're feeling these things, you don't have a diagnosis, you're going to experience them as something outside the realms of normality, or do people do? I don't know.
I think that's really interesting. And, I think number one question is, where was the stroke? That could be a big component on if people might, be experiencing hallucinations or, having those feelings, oh, someone's watching me. I think a lot has to do with where that stroke occurred in the brain. Another thing is that, who are they reporting it, and to who, and are they being listened to is a big thing. I'm telling my physician, hey, I just had a stroke and now I feel like, I'm feeling like I'm haunted now. I feel like I'm seeing ghosts. They're probably going to be like, okay, we'll direct you to, someone else to take care of this issue, or I don't know, it's hard to say. I haven't read anything about stroke and reported hauntings. I don't know, Jenna, did you when you were researching this?
Not specifically about hauntings, but more so about like the experience of limbs not being yours, or sometimes people with stroke, I can't think of the term, but they pretty much deny that they have even had a stroke. So they're experiencing these things, but they can't attribute it to it. One thing that this makes me think of is phantom limb syndrome. So people who had to have an amputation for some reason can still feel pain in this part that they no longer even have, because the somatosensory system still has those wires. It's just not receiving input this way, but it's still going out that way. And I think I have read about people reporting that as like an experience of something supernatural, something paranormal, something that's not theirs.
We are actually starting to get some questions from our audience, if you all would like to start taking those. The first question is, Grady, you combine a lot of comedy with your horror stories. Erica, Jenna, how does the neurological experience of humor complement that of fear to make such an engrossing experience like horror stir? So I guess how do fear and horror complement each other? Fear and humor.
Humor, yeah. Well, I think they're within our emotional systems in our brain and our limbic system, specifically the amygdala, it is a fast track for fear. So perception and recognizing fearful instances or potentially dangerous instances is more advantageous for the humans evolutionarily. Humor is like a nice little bonus, you know, it's not a life or death scenario. So it's actually processed slower in the brain than fear. So like you see a stick and you think, oh my God, it's a snake. It's not really, you know, it was just a stick. It's a pretty quick process. But I don't know, Jenna, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think humor might kind of add to fear in a way, because I think maybe it could serve as like a protective mechanism. Like Erica said, you see a stick, you're like, oh my God, it's a snake. Wait, no, it's a stick. Haha, I'm all good. So I think that we want, you know, like we're innately driven to really experience fearful things, but we want to believe that we're safe. So I think it's kind of maybe psychologically a coping mechanism.
Grady, did you have any thoughts about that? How you mix the humor and the horror?
Yeah, I mean, you
effectively?
know, it's the same mechanism from a writing point of view. I mean, a joke and a horrific moment, they're the same. It's a setup and a punchline. It's build, misdirect, land the gag. And in fact, in horror movies, a special effect, like a prosthetic gore effect or something, is often called a gag, to like a joke or a punchline. And you know, and I would just say that horror and humor and probably porn are the three forms of writing that are designed to elicit a physical response, right? You either want someone to experience that rush of adrenaline, that flight or fight that those guys are talking about, you know, or if you're writing humor, you want someone to laugh uncontrolled, you want them to make a noise. And if you're writing porn, you want them to have a physical arousal. So, you know, yeah, those are the ones designed to sort of do something to your body while you're reading.
We have another question for Conrad. Can you talk about some psychological horror novels? Are there books that get the science right?
Yeah, sure. So one of the most well-known sort of psychological horror novels of the last 10 years is Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. There's also a book that's pretty recent that is called The Grip of It, and I'm gonna get the author's pronunciation wrong, but it's Jack, like Jemec, it's Jemc. But so she wrote The Grip of It, which is about this couple that moves to a house, and then basically like the deterioration of their relationship. And so the haunting is really, you know, potentially like connected to the deterioration of their marriage. There's a book that I read that is one of my favorites the last few years, by Laura Purcell, called The Silent Companions. And they're kind of like chillers, but it's one of those books that legitimately creeped me out. But so you know, it's set maybe during the Victorian era, but this woman purchases this companion, essentially, which is like this 3D portrait of someone. And then it sort of starts to haunt her, and she starts to see more of these silent companions show up in her house. And, you know, she just sort of goes downhill from there. And then, of course, there's the haunting of Hill House, right? And Eleanor and everyone congregating at the house for this study. And, you know, is it haunted, or are they sort of in this social experiment where they're sensing this thing? And, you know, Eleanor has her issues, and is everything manifesting because of what she has been through? And anything that Shirley Jackson does is just amazing. So I love those. Hangs a Man is also sort of a psychological, I'd say a psychological horror novel, because it's all about what is going on in the protagonist's head. And then for the science, there are a couple that I really enjoyed recently. That's The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling, which is sort of space horror. It's a space exploration. It's very claustrophobic. And then I listened to Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, which is basically about a ocean exploration to search for killer mermaids, essentially. But there's a lot of really great science in there and marine biology, and so it's really interesting, and it has like great female protagonist scientists, and they're differently abled characters, and so like it's just a nice sort of fun but inclusive and really interesting book. So I really like Into the Drowning Deep.
Thank you. That's a great list for us to refer to. For Grady, how does psychology play out in your books? It seems like several of your characters look for the rational or scientific explanation before moving to supernatural conclusions.
Yeah, so this is actually something that dovetails nicely with what Conrad was just saying. Talking about the Legend of the Haunting of Hill House. You know, haunted house books come in sort of two flavors, and before, I would say 1976, most haunted house books were about, for the most part, not all of them, for the most part, they were often about investigators. Oh, we've heard this place is haunted and we're going to go in and see what it is, or Legend of Hell House or Haunting of Hill House. Both of those, it's a team of parapsychologists with lots of equipment and science, and they're going to go in and solve this mystery. And you see that a lot. But around 76, which was when the Amityville horror thing happened, they became a lot more, and actually a few years before that with this book called Burnt Offerings by Robert Marasco, but Amityville really made it big. It became economic. Oh, you know, we've got this house and it's way nicer than we should be able to afford, but we're gonna move in because we want to live in a better neighborhood or have an extra bedroom or whatever. Oh crap, you know, the house is haunted and now we've invested, we're gonna lose our equity if we run out, and we're screwed financially. So it kind of went from this investigatory thing to this sort of real estate panic. And the real estate panic novels were always there, but it just around Burnt Offerings and Amityville Horror, they got huge. But talking about the, so one of the things people always do in everything is they look for that scientific explanation before they just give in to absolute fear. And you see that in that history, all those earlier books about people looking for the science. And then suddenly there's like, oh, screw it. It's so much more fun if we just lean into the fear. But you see, that is the big problem in every horror novel about supernatural horror, is at some point you have to make the leap. At some point your characters have to start believing what happens to them. And if you do it too late, everyone thinks they're idiots who are ignoring the evidence of their own senses. If you do it too early, everyone thinks they're a credulous butthead whose brains are made of ice cream. So you have to judge that, and that's always tough. And it's really a gut feeling more than anything. So I really could have just saved all that time and just said, I don't know, it's a gut feeling.
When you always need that character who happens to show up and like the priest or the crazy old lady, or says, oh, I know what it is. It's a haunting.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's something that you have to pay lip service to in every form of horror, like even slashers, even like Friday the 13th. You still have characters who are like, come on, you guys, quit kidding around. I know this severed head is a practical joke. Like, you always have to have that person, like you were just saying.
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask, how do you strike that balance to make sure your horror story is still believable, that people are buying into it?
Gut. It really is. It's, there's no better explanation, unfortunately, which I'm sure as science people is tremendously frustrating.
There's a talent there too, Grady, I'm sure.
Gut.
We have another question, which I think I'll read it out loud, but we may have to poke around in there a little bit. And with no prior knowledge of place, you see a person in the place they are perceived as real. Later find out the person seen is a ghost haunting the location visited. Explanation? So I'm thinking that's for you, Jenna and Erica. Like, what would be an explanation for that?
Well, I think that they're saying that maybe like you have no idea that this place was haunted and other people are feeling the same thing, and then all of a sudden you get that same feeling. And I want to look more into the electromagnetic stuff that Grady actually mentioned, Because, you know, mentioned that whole scenario of moving the bat away from, oh, I forget what it was, but, you know, I think that would be really interesting. And maybe a potential explanation is, okay, what is the environment? You know, what are some other forces at play here? So I don't know. That's what I would
Absolutely.
say for right now.
Yeah, like you hear about CO2 poisoning. People have no idea sometimes that they have it, but one of the main things that can happen is people have hallucinations. I heard a story once of this lady who was just experiencing what she was perceiving as hauntings, and she was having like ghost hunters come and try to figure out what's going on. And they couldn't find anything. They're like, I don't know, everything seems okay here. And it turns out that the CO2 levels in her house were so high that it was actually causing hallucinations. And I've heard before too, if you have this very, very deep noise that's almost imperceivable, that can kind of give that feeling of chills up your spine. Like if there's a huge fan in a building somewhere that you can't see, that can just, you can sense it, but you can't quite make sense of what you're feeling. And that's disturbing. So I guess, you know, that doesn't really get at a visual perception of a ghost, but if you're trying to look for environmental factors, I think those might contribute.
I'm going to ask you to step outside maybe your expertise, but like when you hear stories of animals perhaps seeing something, you know, like the dog's looking at the door expectantly, or the cat looking at the wall and there's nothing there, you know, and people think, oh, that's a supernatural occurrence of some kind. Are there any studies that talk about animals perceptions of quote unquote the unseen or the supernatural?
Well, I would say non-human animals are really perceptive of things that we might not even be aware of, whether that's sounds, olfactory, are big key components, whether that's seeing stuff in a dark room or not. So I think non-human animals being able to almost give us a hint of, hey, you know, I have all of these different senses that are allocated differently, you know, huge olfactory sensories that we can't smell what they smell, and different stuff in that regard. So I think you know, having that little marker of, hey, something might be going on, or I smell something weird, you know, but I haven't heard of any specific studies looking at dogs, but again, that's something to look up. That's so fun.
Yeah, I have a dog who barks at things that scares me all the time. So for Grady, did your mother's career influence some of the psychology in your books?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, not so much the psychology, but really as a writer, your whole job is to cannibalize your own life and like turn it into money. You know, basically it's all material. So yeah, but more than her job, I mean, really, you know, she's someone I lived with for 18 years, several of them as a high-strung adolescent. So, I mean, all that stuff factors in. But one of the things that it did do at an early age, her job working with old people, is it it really made me interested in people who were a little off model, people whose perceptions were a little more, because she was interacting with people who could be totally lucid and completely cogent, but they would have one delusional aspect they would just hold on to. You know, they were, you know, I vaguely remember her, she had someone who, you know, lived on her own, had home health care attendant who would come in and check on her and take care of her several days a week, but mostly could live on her own with a lot of assistance. But she was always convinced it was that she was waiting for the mail, and it didn't matter if the mail had just come. And she had a letter, it was in there. Sometimes it was from a son, sometimes it was from the government, the IRS. So, but it was always an important letter every day, and she was always waiting for it. And she was still waiting for it after the mail came. And it wasn't like she sat there like a dog staring at the door, but this was a big concern for her throughout every single day. And I always thought that was really interesting. Like, you know, that's just, was it a biological thing? You know, she just had a few neurons firing weird, or psychological, who knows? But it really did expose me early on to people who are just sort of, I guess you would say now, neurodivergent in some way.
So we don't have any more questions coming in, and I guess I'd like to give you all an opportunity maybe to say a little bit about the future of horror writing, or the future of psychological investigation of horror, before we end the evening. Maybe Grady, if you want to go first.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, something that's really interesting. It's something I find really weird and interesting, is that, talking about ghosts and all these things, one of the things I did at the ASPR was I answered the phone. Like, there was no one else there. I was answering the phone. And so we'd get people calling in with, and on the first day, actually, my boss sort of set me up for this. She's like, look, you're going to have people calling in saying they've seen a ghost, saying they've seen their dead child, saying that there's a psychic energy vampire in the upstairs apartment who's sucking their strength. Like, people are going to call in with stuff. And she's like, and you cannot validate them. They could be on medication you don't know about. They could be messing with you. They could be severely mentally ill. You have no idea. So you cannot validate the experience they're having. And then she said, at the same time, you can't invalidate their experience either, because what do you know? You're the office manager, like you're the office guy. Like, you don't know if there's life after death. For all we know, there are ghosts everywhere. We don't know. So don't validate, don't invalidate. And so mostly what I did was listen. And what I could say to people were sort of two things. And one was that, well, actually, let me jump back and say, I sort of developed this profile of, and it was anecdotal, of people who would call in, but often it was more often than not women. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I don't think it's because women are more haunted or more likely to go, but I think women might be more comfortable reaching out to talk to someone about some emotional or personal experience they're having. But it was often women. It was often people who'd experienced a huge upheaval. They'd moved to a new city, they'd changed jobs, they had an illness or an injury they'd had recently. And often they were experiencing great stress. They'd had a death in the family, they had a sick child, they had financial issues. And like one example, we had a woman who had just moved to another state, very far away. She'd just gotten divorced. She's a single mom, and her grandmother, who she was very close to, had passed away. And she was calling us because she was terrified, because she was seeing the ghost of her grandmother in her child's room. Her child was, I think, 18 months. And she was terrified. And I get it. It's a dead person in your kid's room. That's scary, terrifying. And sort of that's a situation none of us want. No one wants to find a dead person in their kid's room. And so the two things I said to her, which I was able to say sort of to everyone, which was that, one, you might be crazy. Like, I don't know you. But because you're having this experience, that isn't proof that you're crazy, because the experience you're having is very common. Going back to that Nora Sidgwick survey, one of the things she said was an interesting finding in this survey is it was impossible to say that these experiences were the product of what people called a disordered mind, which is hallucinations at the time were attributed to disordered mind or disorders of the mind. She said, we can't say that anymore because too many people report these. If this is a disorder, then everyone, so many people, the majority of people are disordered, which means the disordered mind is the ordered mind. And that doesn't make any sense. And so she's like, this is not proof that this person is suffering from a disorder of the mind. And so I can say that to people because I'm surrounded, in this building by this archive where people have reported similar experiences. We have a peer-reviewed journal going back to 1885, lots of words. So this doesn't make you crazy. And the other thing I could say to them was, because you're having, in all the accounts of these experiences, I've never read of anyone being injured or hurt. And there aren't, there just aren't, that just doesn't exist. It's great in movies, but in real reports of apparitions, no one ever gets injured or anything. Maybe they bump into a wall, that's about it. And usually once, and this woman was a good example, usually once people are like, okay, so I'm not crazy. And this is a common experience lots of people have, and it's not gonna hurt me. Then they would start to wonder what it meant. Like, that person who was asking about, you see this person in a room, my first question would be, well, why? Why are you seeing this person in this room? Like, what does that mean to you? And actually, this woman actually called us back about 6 weeks later to say, I actually really thought about what was going on here. And she's like, and I realized I really miss my grandmother. And my grandmother never saw my child. She died before they were born. And she's like, and I actually spoke to her and it was really nice. And I haven't seen her since. And I mean, that's all very pat and very sort of like, blah, 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 put a bow on it. But I think we stop getting scared about these things and start asking why I'm seeing this and what. And I think, you know, Erica and Jenna make a good point. There's tons of physical reasons and biological reasons you might be seeing this, but also for you as a person, as someone in this total experience, what does it mean to you? You know, and really I would say lean into it, because if you don't walk away with some kind of useful information, I'd be very surprised.
Lean into it. I like that.
Yeah, Grady, kind of what you were saying, I think experiencing hauntings, so many people do. It's such a human experience. And maybe it's not neuroscience's role to say whether ghosts are real or not. We can only support that this is happening in the brain because of this in certain circumstances. And we have likelihood, right? But I think maybe one place that psychology and neuroscience could really take these experiences of hauntings, no matter what someone attributes them to, I think it would be so interesting to find out, do these have a function or are they just a byproduct of consciousness?
Well, so we have multiple questions popping up now, which is great. So I think just right off of what you were just talking about, do you believe in ghosts? Are ghosts real? Are we like Mulder from X-Files? We want to believe. Thoughts?
In just a general way, I would say, yeah, I think a lot of why ghost stories are so appealing and have always been so appealing is because we want to believe that there is more, right? We all deal with mortality and loss and grief. And so you want to think that there's something, regardless of what you believe that thing is. And I feel like hauntings are like they're intangible, but a tangible thing to point to and say like, okay, well, this is a potential for what happens after we die. So I think we want to believe mostly because we want to think that there is something more after death.
Couple of more questions here too. Very interesting. Do other cultures use the same terminology, such as ghosts and spirits, to describe scary experiences, or is it because of our Christian beliefs? So is this idea of, I guess, ghosts and spirits maybe being bad or scary, is that a Christian part of Christianity, or is that something that's universal in terms of supernatural experiences?
Universal. I mean, there's differences in language and differences in terminology, but universal.
Another question, can all of the panelists talk about feminism in the work? In the past, women's fears were discounted as hysteria. How has that changed? How are writers and scientists changing these ideas? Where might these ideas go in the future? Very interesting.
So I think that's a great point to make. And, aside from hysteria and aside from, hauntings or, women and emotion, I think women have been just severely understudied in kind of all aspects, So I, as a scientist, strive to kind of close that gap and make up for lost times in our research as well, Jenna as well. So I think that's our part in where I see our science moving forward specifically. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't until the past, 30 or so years that I believe it's the NIH started requiring that female subjects even be used in experiments. It wasn't until recently that these scientific communities really required that female participants also be looked at. So women have just totally been underserved in science. And I think that's like a huge problem. Like, we need diversity in science to even think of these perspectives. We're all coming from different perspectives. And it's so easy. Like, imagine it's all men in science at one time, and a woman is experiencing hysteria. And what do they call it? A wandering uterus. Like, I think having some different perspectives females and different races and cultures in science can really help make sense of the biological reasons for a lot of ideas.
Absolutely. So this has to be our last question, I know, and thank you so much for all of your time this evening, but do any of you believe in ghosts, or has this, are we completely on the side of the rational and biology explains everything?
I'll go and say, yeah, I'd like to believe that there are ghosts. You know, it seems to me like if so many people are saying, well, this thing exists, then maybe it does. And, you know, like I was saying, I think that hope that there is more, regardless of what you believe in, I like to keep that alive. So, and I always say I would like to see a ghost, but not by myself. So I would be more than happy to see one with some other people with me.
Hysteria.
I'm just going to jump in real quick, if y'all don't mind, and say, you know, it's funny because believing in ghosts, there you get into a lot of terminology issues. So, I mean, not to invoke William James again, but one of the things he said was, you know, there is no such thing as parapsychology. At a certain point, it will all be mainstream science. We just haven't finished science yet. It's not done. You know, everything will be explained. When people talk about ghosts, they're often talking about the issue of survival. Do we survive bodily death? And there's been a lot of research on that, a lot of research. And the answer to this point, the way we're able to do it, doesn't seem compelling, you know, that we survive bodily death, but people are still looking at it. People are still have things they can't explain. To me, it's so much more important what it means than, and I think Jenna put her finger on the question, is it a useful function of consciousness? Or is it just like, you know, rats in the wiring? And I think that's really important, because to believe that ghosts are somehow proof of the survival of bodily death, I mean, good God, what are you talking about? Like you're violating physics. There's so much stuff that would have to be, so many hurdles to be jumped to get there. But if that woman who was having that experience with her grandmother in a kid's room, if I said, well, actually, that's not a ghost, it's an electromagnetic field, and it's also, you know, pareidolia, and I'd be the asshole. This woman is experiencing a ghost. And if I'm not engaging with it and what that means to her and what that is emotionally with her, I'm not talking to her. I'm yelling at her about things I'm concerned about, but nothing she's concerned about.
Yeah, I think that was a great example and a great way to sum it up. And it's more, instead of like, if you experience having a ghost, or you are believing that it's real and that it's there. And I think that's the critical component. Have I had any circumstances where, you know, I've seen a ghost or perceived a ghost? No, I haven't yet. Maybe that's in my future. But I just want to say that, you know, this whole experience and, you know, being a part of this panel has been so great. I haven't found a genre of books that I've liked to read until I was like, oh, like I'll read, you know, the final girls support group. And now, you know, I'm going through the classics and I love it because it takes me out of the science. I do science all day and sometimes I want to get scared, you know, and not sleep at night. So, you know, I think that it's all relative. It's in the eye of the beholder. And if you're not the beholder, you can't say if things are real or not, truly. So thank you, everyone.
Same page, Erica. I totally think what you experience is what is real to you. And as a neuroscientist, I have to lean on these different biological reasons sometimes. But as a curious human, I kind of lean the other way. So it really depends how you perceive things and what you want to know.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to end. Thank you all. This is for your time and for your insight. This has been extraordinary. So thank you. And I'm sure if we were in a room physically, there'd be rounds of applause. So thank you. This has been another Future Telling program. And I just want to thank our audience as well for the great questions, for the interaction. We hope to be doing these in person in the future. I don't know if that'll be the spring semester or if that'll be summer, but we will be doing these in person in the future. So thank you again, and have a good evening. Happy Halloween.
Thank you all.